Welcome back, and we are going to be looking on a slightly similar but separate topic. It's in within the realms of human rights. Um, Within the realms of human rights, but looking at another institution, which is the International Criminal Court, and it's in another publication that um, I published, which is titled "The International Criminal Court and Kenya," and exploring the effectiveness of the ICC and its impact on the rule of law and human rights in Kenya. So, one of the reasons that led to sort of looking into this issue is obviously events that have transpired primarily, or at least came to head in 2007, when Kenya had one of its elections since the so-called liberalization of the political space by the then late, or at least was forced to, by the then late President Daniel Moi, and although the space was liberalized, there's still issues around human rights and around the credibility of the votes, both in terms of the overall totality of the process and also the outcome. And so, and I think one cannot escape. We cannot analyze post-colonial African states without the elements of tribes and communities on which these were reinforced by the colonial mechanisms in terms of divide and rule, but also which were, I think I would say, accentuated and deepened in some cases, not all, post-colonially, and the sort of which determine the power structures and the successive governments that followed. And that sort of percolates throughout some in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have communities and tribes. It's part of the culture history. It's a way in which communities operate. It's cultural heritage. It's cultural pride. But I think what has since sadly happened is that these structures were left behind by the respective colonial, should I say, masters, a word that I hesitate to use. Then this led to conflict in some countries. I think the most poignant one was in Rwanda, which was genocide. We've seen it in other countries like Congo, Zimbabwe, and in this case, the focus of this book, Kenya. And so in 2007 there was violence, widespread violence in Kenya following the election. And so what sort of caught my eye was to whether the intervention, at least the partial and then withdrawal of the International Criminal Court from Kenya, following the indictment of the then former President Uhuru and now the current President Ruto, I mean, whether they sort of explore how effective the ICC was in that case, and what was the impact on the rule of law and human rights in Kenya. And so that is what the book sets out to explore. And really the aim of the text is to determine the effectiveness of the ICC in general in the aftermath of the Kenya case in particular, and whether it has any positive impact since then on the democratic credentials of Kenya. We should mention since 2007, where are we now? 2023. There have been successive elections, many of them largely peaceful per se, although there were reports of violence and unexplained, what should we say, incidents. And I think in one case, the resignations of folks that sit on the election commission, and I think the most recently concluded one side of the election commissioners refused to endorse the outcomes of the announced declared elections. The case subsequently went to court, and the Supreme Court overwhelmingly ruled, which effectively ruled that the results stand, for whatever reason which we can't go into the specific details of the case. But I think what was remarkable as the world held its breath was that, and I think I wrote about it in an article, was that Kenya remained largely peaceful, tense, and during there were some sort of skirmishes at the, I think they're called bomber grounds, where elections were being collated, and where the commissions were. But on the whole, at least comparatively, the elections remained peaceful, and the process, even to going through the court process, was largely tense but peaceful. And when the court announced the decision, the results were respected. I would say the court's decision was not, at least legally, opposed, and the main protagonist, which was Raila Odinga, some refer to him as a veteran presidential contender, largely issued a statement, essentially, letting matters lie where they are as per the court's decision. And so that is the factual content and context of where Kenya is at the moment. And this text was started prior to that, but the aim of the text is really to determine whether the effectiveness of the ICC, or the action of the ICC going back 2007, how effective it was, and how effective it was in general or what impact it had on Kenya's democratic roadmap and where it is today. So just for general context for those who might not know very much about Kenya, Kenya is an East African country that has a mixed history. It's a former colony of Britain, which had a violent process to its independence, I think in 1963, but has since had sort of relative peace and stability in comparison to its neighbors. After one of the key founding fathers, Jomo Kenyatta, passed away in 1978, Moi, the then vice president, assumed power. And in the early 1990s, after international and local pressure, Moi opened up a political space to a multi-party system. And this has led to the election of Mike back in 2002, who ruled, I think, around until 2013. But it was the disputed election of 2007 that led to the widespread violence and bloodshed that led to the indictment of the alleged perpetrators, key alleged perpetrators of violence, according to the ICC, alleged indictments that were subsequently withdrawn, and they were later to become president and vice president, respectively, and the case collapsed due to a number of factors which I examined in the book, and so which raises questions as to the effectiveness of the ICC in general, the way it conducted that case, and whether, irrespective of whether the indictments were withdrawn, and there's no case to answer, whether that had some sort of psychological impact on the political class in general and their supporters, and that has had a positive impact in the subsequent elections, and whether that has a direct or at least indirect correlation to the prevailing peacefulness of the elections in particular, and respect for the court decisions, Supreme Court decisions, and the rule of law. That doesn't mean that the courts are perfect and that there are no issues raised there, but the fact that there was a court process and the participants or the antagonists respected it and their supporters, and there's no repeat of the previous violence, such as the one that we saw in 2007 that led to the subsequent intervention of the ICC, which later withdrew and the case collapsed. And so that, in general, that's what the sort of book explores in some, in some detail. Although I think, as they say, time tells, and that in the depth of time, we will know whether there is a direct correlation or indirect correlation to the ICC intervention in Kenya, which was aborted, and the subsequent elections, and the largely non-repeat, at least we can say, of the scale of violence in 2007. And if so, is that something that could be impactful in other countries, not just in sub-Saharan Africa? We have seen, for example, in Brazil, just at least recent weeks, where there's an invasion of the corridors of power, of buildings, violence, destruction of property, in a bid, what appears to be in a bid to stop the democratic process of the elected and sworn government of Lula. We also had now several indictments and a year-long, or at least over a year-long investigation into what is called now January 6th Committee and indictments, when the well-armed mob invaded the U.S. Congress and desecrated property, police officers lost lives, others were injured. The then Vice President Mike Pence had to be evacuated, plus those in the line of succession, such as the then Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other members of Congress, were taken to secure locations. And the reverberations and the consequences of that are ongoing. And many of the alleged perpetrators, at least, I mean, it's on in public record, the videos are there, were alleged to be associated with members of white supremacist groups, violent groups, racist groups. And so it's almost as if now violent challenge to authority, to democratic, historically ironclad democratic countries like the United States, in which we are all proud, appears to be taking root when we see from what's happening in what happened in Brazil. And so maybe this is not clearly not isolated to Kenya, although it's not the same scale of violence. We had Rwanda, although that's a different context. But we had similar issues, for example, in Zimbabwe. We have had similar issues in South Sudan, which led to wide-scale civil war, and so ditto in the north of Sudan, which is still sort of ongoing, that ousted the then President Omar Bashir, supposedly elected government, or at least a non-civilian government, was put in place, but then overturned. We have seen similar instances in other countries, and so the analogy really of this book is to try to juxtapose whether that non-repeat of those violent incidents, such as the one that happened in Kenya 2007, whether there's any correlation between the cessation of, or at least a lack of repeat of that wide-scale violence, with the intervention, or at least the purported intervention of the ICC, at least on a psychological level, into the psyche of the political actors and their supporters. That is the whole rationale of the book. And again, it's on Amazon, both in Kindle and paperback, and it's entitled International Criminal Court in Kenya, Exploring the Effectiveness of the ICC, and its impact on the rule of law and human rights in Kenya. And so there we have it. We will pause for this segment, and we will come back in another segment. I'll see you soon. Let's go for a break.